Welcome to this explainer. We usually hear about the survival of Jamestown as this grand, triumphant story. But today, we're stepping into the shadows. We're going to dig into a seriously unsettling chapter of history, one that bridges 17th century horrors with modern forensic science. This stuff matters because it shows us exactly how close English America came to being totally erased before it even really began. So, let's dive right in and uncover the true, chilling cost of early American colonization.
For literally hundreds of years, historians argued back and forth about this. Were the darkest, most gruesome tales of Jamestown actually real, or were they just sensationalized political rumors meant to ruin reputations? Well, we don't have to wonder anymore. Down in a 1608-era kitchen cellar, archaeologists made a discovery that proved the absolute worst colonial nightmares were true.
The researchers unearthed the partial remains of a 14-year-old girl. They decided to name her Jane, and the forensic analysis, which was done by the Smithsonian Institution, was utterly terrifying. They found that her skull bore the marks of 3 different metal tools, chops and slices made in a frantic, desperate effort to remove flesh. To really understand what happened to Jane, we have to talk about survival cannibalism. It's exactly what it sounds like. A desperate, absolute last resort to prolong life by consuming human remains when a settlement is literally teetering on the brink of extinction. Jane wasn't just an isolated tragedy. She was a victim of an entire colony's collapse. But how in the world did an English settlement descend into this kind of hell?
Section 1, 1609, a trifecta of disasters.
Let's rewind to the summer of 1609. The timeline of this disaster is just brutal. In July, a massive supply fleet is battered by a hurricane, and the flagship, the Sea Venture, which was carrying the colony's leaders and all the main provisions, wrecks off the coast of Bermuda. The next month, the rest of that battered fleet limps into Jamestown, dumping 300 starving, unprovisioned settlers right into the fort. And to make matters worse, these new arrivals managed to eat through the colony's entire 7-acre crop of corn in just 3 days. By November, a deadly siege had begun.
So, why the siege? Well, Captain John Smith, who was the colony's main military guy and native negotiator, suffered some really severe burns in a mysterious gunpowder explosion. He had to pack up and return to London in October. Sensing this massive power vacuum, and honestly just tired of English aggression, Chief Powhatan ordered a tight military blockade. As John Smith later wrote, the native warriors all revolted and did murder and spoil all they could encounter. But they didn't assault the fort head-on. Instead, they weaponized famine. They trapped the colonists inside the walls, shot anyone who tried to step out and forage, and systematically slaughtered all of the colonists' free-ranging livestock.
Section 2, Winter 1609 to 1610, the sharp prick of hunger.
The president of the council during this time, George Percy, called this period feeling the sharp prick of hunger. And what's truly fascinating here is how the written historical record and the physical archaeological bones match up perfectly. Scientists studied the animal bones from the fort's wells and cellars, and they noticed this massive shift. It went from your normal butchered deer and fish to horses, dogs, cats, rats, and snakes. When all the animals were gone, they boiled leather boots, and when the boots were gone, they turned to the dead.
George Percy's eyewitness accounts are just harrowing. He wrote that not a thing was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seemed incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and to eat them. There were even reports of settlers licking up the blood of their weak, dying friends. English society out there on the frontier hadn't just cracked, it had completely and utterly broken down.
And out of all these dark horrors, there's one account that stands out as the most infamous. Percy recorded that one colonist murdered his pregnant wife as she slept. He then ripped the unborn child out, threw it into the river, chopped the mother into pieces, and salted her to preserve her flesh for food. This horrific crime was only discovered after he had already eaten a portion of her.
Since law and morality had completely collapsed, conventional justice went right out the window with it. Percy, acting as the leader, exacted a brutally intense extrajudicial punishment on this murderer. The man was hung by his thumbs with heavy weights attached to his feet until he finally confessed, and then he was burned alive. That's a punishment that didn't even exist under standard English law for murder at the time.
Section 3, 2012, The Forensic Truth of Jane.
We know the survivors documented this extreme descent into madness, but let's step out of the past for a second and into the sterile, undeniable reality of 21st century forensic science to figure out who our victim, Jane, actually was.
By testing the stable carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen isotopes locked deep inside her bones and teeth, scientists can literally reconstruct a person's diet. A long-term resident of America would have a diet heavily based on corn. But Jane's bones? They showed a European wheat-based diet. That means she was a recent immigrant, highly likely arriving on that doomed supply fleet back in August 1609, just months before the starvation set in.
Also, there wasn't a single trace of lead in her bones. Now, why does that matter? Well, back then, the wealthy gentry ate their meals off of pewter plates, which actually leached lead into their bodies. Jane's lack of lead means she was eating off of wooden or ceramic plates. She was likely a lower-class maidservant, maybe one of the folks Percy haughtily referred to as the unruly gallants dumped on the colony. Just imagine that for a second. Surviving a terrifying Atlantic crossing and a shipwreck, only to face the absolute worst of the famine. Now, it's absolutely crucial that we clarify what the science is telling us here. The chopped skull and severed leg bone 100% confirm she was butchered and eaten. But, and this is a big but, there's zero forensic evidence that she was actually murdered for her flesh. It's overwhelmingly likely that, just like the vast majority of the colonists, Jane died of sickness or starvation, and her body was simply scavenged post-mortem by the desperate survivors.
Section 4. Abandonment and Salvation.
60. That is it. That is all that was left. Out of the roughly 300 men, women, and children who were crowded into that fort just 6 months earlier, only 60 gaunt, completely emaciated survivors remained by May of 1610.
Remember the leadership castaways who wrecked on Bermuda in the sea venture? Well, over 10 months, they miraculously managed to build 2 small ships from local cedar and salvaged iron. They called them the Patience and the Deliverance. They sailed to Virginia fully expecting to find a thriving, bustling colony. Instead, Sir Thomas Gates arrived to find a ruined fortress full of walking corpses. The horror must have been completely beyond expression.
Assessing this absolute ghost town, Gates made the only logical decision he could. He ordered the colony abandoned. On June 7, 1610, they buried the fort's heavy cannon so the Spanish couldn't swoop in and take them. Then, they boarded the 60 survivors onto their makeshift ships and began to sail down the James River toward Newfoundland. The plan was to catch a ride on a fishing fleet back to England and leave Virginia behind forever.
But then, on June 8th, an absolute cinematic miracle occurred. They were just 13 miles down the James River when the retreating, starved settlers were suddenly intercepted by a heavily armed, fully supplied relief fleet.
This new fleet was commanded by the new governor, Lord Delaware. He immediately forced their survivors to turn their ships right back around. Delaware brought 150 fresh settlers and a full year's worth of provisions, but he also brought an iron fist. He implemented strict, brutal martial law to impose discipline and completely shifted the colony from a defensive crouch into a highly aggressive, scorched-earth military campaign against the Powhatans. And honestly, this violent stabilization is what ultimately saved the colony from going under.
Which leaves us with this final thought. We tend to think of history as this inevitable, steady march of progress, right? But the forensic evidence of Jane proves just how incredibly fragile it all was. Think about it. If the winds had blown just slightly differently, and Lord Delaware had arrived even a week later, those ships would have been long gone. Jamestown would have been swallowed up by the forest. Would the dark horrors of the starving time have erased the very idea of English America before it even began? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the history you think you know.